Well, thank you, everybody. It's been my great honor and privilege to have been selected to present this Middle Rio Grande case study to the Argentine scholars. It's been a rewarding experience for me, and I hope it's been interesting and educational for them. But my job today is to just tell you about the case study, and we'll hear about solutions tomorrow. I would just like to say a few words of self-introduction. I'm a retired engineer who is still practicing. I became a peace engineer when I was in my 40s without being familiar with the term. I moved from being a water engineer to a water policy engineer, and I treated that as a peace engineering from a peace engineering perspective. And I retired completely in 2014 and became an activist. And I had a small community organization that advocates for water sanity in New Mexico and in the Middle Rio Grande. Let me start with the geographic boundaries of the Middle Rio Grande. The gray shaded area is the basin of the Rio Grande above Fort Whitman, Texas, at which point the river almost always is dry. The water's used up. Colorado's on the north, New Mexico in the middle, and a small piece of Southwest Texas and part of Mexico on the south. The Middle Rio Grande extends from the Otoe Gauge down to Elephant Butte Dam. And one of the issues in the Middle Rio Grande is delivering through the Middle Rio Grande, the lower Rio Grande share of the water that flows into the Middle Rio Grande basin. An interstate agreement called an Interstate Stream Compact was entered into by New Mexico and Colorado and Texas in 1938. It was approved by the Congress of the United States, signed by the President. It is both federal law and state law in all three states. The graphic shows how the water that flows into the Middle Rio Grande has to be distributed. For example, the total wedge that's colored on this graphic goes from a flow of 0 on the left to 3 million acre feet on the right. The orange slice is what New Mexico is obligated to deliver through the Middle Rio Grande for use downstream. The turquoise slice is represents the water that's available for consumption within the Middle Rio Grande. New Mexico owes 57% of the inflows to be delivered downstream. It's obligated to do that. And at higher flow years, like in this year, New Mexico has to deliver 100% of the marginal increases in flows. And that is a tall order. The Otoe Gauge is here on the left. It's just a picture of a river. You've heard about Los Alamos. This gauge is on the bridge or right below the bridge on the road up to Los Alamos, the bridge that crosses the Rio Grande. This is Elephant Butte Dam. The picture was taken a couple of years ago. This is Elephant Butte Reservoir. The dam is barely visible on the upper left. The reservoir is almost empty. It's vast, and a large percentage of the water that makes it through the Middle Valley evaporates in Elephant Butte Reservoir, and that is charged against the Middle Valley's apportionment. Heron Reservoir is constructed in a tributary to the Rio Grande. It holds water that's imported into New Mexico from the Colorado River Basin. It's imported under the Continental Divide through tunnels. Albuquerque, Middle Valley irrigators, Santa Fe, and Los Lunas are entitled the bulk of this water. But as you can see, what used to be a firm yield of about a fourth of the Rio Grande inflow entitlement, it was supposed to be the firm yield, but with climate change and drought, the reservoir is almost empty. You can see the floating boat dock at the end of the boat ramp and the dry reservoir bed. And to put this all together schematically, let me just explain. This graphic, and the numbers don't matter, but the arrows do. The graphic starts with the portion of Otoe gauge inflows that belong to the Middle Valley. The San Juan Chama project water, the water from Heron Reservoir, comes in. It flows through the Otoe gauge. We have tributary inflows, the green areas coming in, and tributary groundwater recharge tributary groundwater inflows into the river. Now pumping is such that those tributary inflows are intercepted. The red arrows denote the depletions in various segments. And the bottom line in this study, and I'll talk just briefly about the study, the bottom line is that under the conditions of 1950 through 2000 hydrology, this budget was developed with a risk model, and that was determined to be the average hydrology. 2000 development conditions, the conditions that existed in the year 2000 were applied to that. And the result was a 40,000 acre foot deficit in the water that New Mexico delivers downstream. So this is the theoretical budget on average. In addition to that, this area right here depicts 71,000 acre feet of depletions of stored groundwater. The way the river hydrology works, gravity pays the aquifer back. It does it slowly, but it does it inexorably. And over time, every gallon of water pumped from the aquifer will be recharged by the river over great periods of time. So theoretically, we're in the red. Since this budget was developed, and it included the two wettest decades in the last millennium, we have just been through the two driest years in the last millennium, decades in the last millennium. And this budget certainly doesn't apply now, but part of the case study problem is this is the most recent water budget information that we have. I commissioned this water budget study when I was a director of New Mexico State Water Agency, and the budget has not been updated or maintained since I left in 2002. This graphic is also from that same study, and it shows where the water goes. So if you go back up to this graphic, it basically divides all these red arrows and puts them into this pie chart. So I'm going to start with the biggest slice, which is colored orange. That is the evapotranspiration losses from riparian vegetation, from the bosque, from the cottonwood forest. It provides habitat for fish and wildlife. It is valued as an environmental asset. In fact, the people in the Albuquerque area treasure the bosque, as do people, throughout the whole Middle Valley. The next biggest slice of depletions, and it's only a quarter of the budget of this historical budget, which is no longer applicable. A quarter of it goes to support irrigated agriculture. This is the water that's used by the crops. This budget, let me switch to the next biggest slice. It's reservoir evaporation. And in these years, the reservoirs were much fuller than we are now. This slice would have shrunk. The blue slice is open water evaporation from the river itself. and from open water beside the river. There's not that much of it, but it's also quite significant. And this tiny little gray slice is the depletion of the river caused by urban groundwater pumping for drinking water for people. Now, that slice of the budget dramatically underestimates the impact because most of the groundwater pumping impacts have been to the aquifer, not to the river. And in reality, that slice of urban water use is probably about 8 or 9% of the total water availability. And it generates almost half of New Mexico's economic output. So most of the water goes to uses that don't generate much economic output, and very little is used by to basically create jobs and products and support the university and all of these sorts of things. So it's a relatively small slice. This graphic shows the compact compliance history. And I'm not going to delve into the history at all, except to say that there is a story behind every up and down. New Mexico regained compliance when the Middle Rio Grande was channelized by the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1950s. When the state engineer of the state of New Mexico exercised his jurisdiction over groundwater pumping and required groundwater pumping to be supported by the retirement of agricultural water rights. And you can see that on the far left-hand area of the curve, that we are entering a period of trouble. This graphic shows that period of trouble, and it shows that in the Middle Rio Grande, we are using more than the supply that is legally available to us to consume in the Middle Rio Grande. We're using water that is really belongs to the people who depend on the Rio Grande below Elephant Butte Dam for their water supply. The trend is down with a few brief pauses. The current year, 2023, worries me a lot because 2023 is a wet year, and it's going to be a lot like 2019 when we had a huge deficit in our annual deliveries under the compact. It's not beyond the question that we would violate the compact. We will have been found to have violated the compact delivery requirements when the accounting for 2023 is complete. My mission now, and the mission of the organization that I lead, and of relatively few other people in the Middle Valley, is to prevent a tragedy of the Middle Rio Grande Water Resources Commons. The water resources of the Middle Valley are the public's. People have a right to use it, but it's the public's water, and it would be a violation of public welfare and public interest if we allowed ourselves to violate the compact. But we don't have the means in place to prevent such a violation. The water governance in the Middle Valley is passive or reactive. Permits were issued. Once the permits were issued, there's really no control over the amount of water a person uses. There's no measurement of agricultural uses. The parts of water governance in New Mexico between the local institutions, which operate as self-serving silos, cuts against the public interest of the region. And New Mexico's water management agencies, and I know this firsthand because I was the director of one of those agencies for 6 years, they lack the capacity to implement state water law. There's an interesting story behind this poll, which was sponsored a year ago by two foundations who operate in New Mexico, the Thornburg Foundation and the Water Foundation. They commissioned this telephone pole of, and let me read the details. I guess they don't have the details. Oh, research and polling conducted 706 phone interviews of registered voters from a representative cross-section of rural, suburban, and urban parts of the state. So it really is a broad cross-section. The public feels some urgency around these issues. Sustainability is very important, and people agreed that we need more water data. We don't have sufficient data, and that's my personal opinion as well. So the public is behind this. Sustainability is an urgent priority. But our government are not reacting. And we have to get them to react. We have to get people engaged. That is the nature of this case study. And that was the assignment to my Argentine friends. I'm happy to have a discussion and answer questions. Gonzalo.
Yeah, I have a question on it. In the last part of your presentation, you mentioned that it was the public's opinion that there wasn't enough data, or it was your opinion there is no enough data. Considering the Water Data Act from 2019 and its efforts to recollect, to gather, and to consolidate data, is that something based on the absence of the data in the data process, or the communication of the data that's being gathered that impacts the public's opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gonzalo. Progress is incremental, and we heard that I think particularly from Joe in his presentation. And incremental progress makes me impatient because I feel like we don't have the time to do that, but it's the way things work. The Water Data Act was passed in 2019. It was passed by a very progressive legislator who is now a New Mexico congressional representative, Representative Melanie Stansberry. And the word is that she introduced this bill, which passed, to see if any water bill could pass the New Mexico legislature. It did. The New Mexico legislature has been stingy in funding it, even though it has a surplus of revenue. But the framework is there and it is superb. The problem is that much of the state's water data, essentially all of it, is in file cabinets and in state agency spreadsheets, and it's not interoperable, it's not accessible. I mean, we have crucial records that are still on paper. We still operate with paper records in the state. So the Water Data Act was a big advance. The legislature did give New Mexico Tech, who hosts a bureau of the state's geological survey, who's in charge of implementing the Water Data Act. They did get some funding, and they are making great progress with the funding we have. We have a lot of talented people, but we don't give them the resources that they need to do their job. And unfortunately, as you know, we have a volunteer legislature, and it is very hard to get their ear.
A question for you. So the pie chart that you showed, right, the urban use of water is a small percentage, 3% there, maybe 8%. Okay. The city of Albuquerque, the Riverside here in the city, had a lot of, over the last 20 years, right? How do we consume less water? There has been a lot of successes there. So we're affecting the Great Wedge, but the Great Wedge has very little impact in the home. How do you, what comes to mind to affect some of the big lakes, right? Like evaporation, like invasive species like salt cedar that sucks a lot of water out of the river. where we can actually have more of an impact on the bigger ranges of the pie.
Well, we need a plan that figures all of that out, and legislation that was passed this year, it was landmark legislation. More important than the water data, I think, provides for that planning. But as we've heard, the 80-20 rule should apply here. We need to work on the portions of the budget where it will make the most difference. And I think that that's going to be more difficult. Let me say one thing with regard to, let's see, sorry, this chart. We would have all, well, it's really with regard to the budget. It's my personal opinion that we would have been in compact debt and in litigation now had the city not cut its water use in half, had the diversion of water for irrigation not been cut in half. They went from 12 feet of irrigation diversions per acre per year to 6 feet. 6 feet's a lot of water. The city cut its per capita use in half, and nobody can criticize the city, the water authority's customers per capita use. But the other sectors of the budget are less amenable to solutions. Frankly, it's all associated with land use. So irrigation land use causes depletions. Riparian land use causes depletions. In the early years, when the river was channelized in the 1950s, and it led to this huge recovery right here, it dramatically reduced depletions from the riparian area and from open water evaporation, those two big slices. But since then, the United States has passed the Endangered Species Act. The silvery minnow probably has the superior right on the river, and habitat is very important for endangered birds. And that habitat and water for the minnow are consuming water. And you know, that's why we need a plan, and it blows my mind that we don't yet have one, but we don't. I was going to tell Bruce that, in fact, I had a reference to it, I think, on this slide. Let's see, let me find it. Wrong one. How will we transition to sustainable resilience? I love that term. I had not thought of it before or heard it used.
It's actually trademark.
I have your trademark notice there. But it's a perfect term for what we need in the Middle Valley. I think it's possible for us to be sustainable. It's crucial that we become more resilient and to do that in a sustainable manner. So my question to Bruce is, when I use that term, do I always have to put TM there?
You do well in and off, or you can put on. That's sort of because it is a registered trade. Yes. And the intent, and by the way, I appreciate you using it. The intent of trademarking is so that people don't just define or other define a term like that. It's intended to be ultimately a credit rating term that describes, as you saw in the periodic table explanation, the probability that all the quality of life elements in your periodic table that are representative of your government budget will improve over the next 10 years as contrasted with the last 10 years by at least 10%. So it would have a quantifiably rigorous outcome.
So in that case, it's a brand, but the way I would like to use it is as our objective for water management in the middle Rio Grande and elsewhere in the state of New Mexico.
Well, and I'll suggest to you that there's a little bit of both in it, in the sense that by including everything the government budgets to spend for it, and the KPIs of that, you can relate back to what role the water management play in accelerating the likelihood of an improvement in those quality of life elements, in health, in all the other things. So I think there's a middle ground.
I also thought I'd take this opportunity just to say that I think one of New Mexico's greatest needs, and this is a realization through you inviting me to this symposium and this conference, is New Mexico has a huge need for financial engineering of solutions. It is immense. The legislature has surplus money these days. The thing we need, I think, more than anything else for the legislature is a financially engineered plan for water in New Mexico. How do we get that?
I just also want to bring a little bit of history. You know, the water management of the Rio Grande was one of the approach to decrease the incidence and prevalence of malaria here in New Mexico. Last century, it was, you know, irrigation was not with floods, so it was a lot of mosquito here. And the part of the building infrastructure was a grant that was received from the federal government to do the canalization of the Rio Grande. And the idea was just to prevent malaria. The first health promotion movie to do, you know, health education and health literacy was filmed here in New Mexico by the Rockefeller Foundation to do water management to prevent malaria. So if by you guys want to be in Atlanta, but I don't think that you have enough time to go to the CDC museum, but that's kind of like one of the exhibits that is at the CDC museum to, you know, the use of environment, you know, kind of managing environmental health to decrease infectious disease. So that also, that history of the first use movies in health promotion, the intersectorial collaboration for health in terms of building infrastructure also happened here in New Mexico. So that's that kind of lead kind of close back in terms of like how the river is, you know, is like a Rio Grande in New Mexico is not only helping us to do food production, but also how to maintain wildlife, but also how is kind of vital to our own health